So for those who've gotten here, welcome. I'm the disembodied voice that's introducing Bassam, who's going to be talking about Drupal development in the cloud.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining the session. Today I'll be talking about Drupal development in the cloud. And before I start, let me sort of clear the air and just say it out loud that with cloud, I don't necessarily mean the cloud in the air, but the physical servers that we have. So a little bit about me. My name is Bassam Ismail, and I work as a director of front-end services at Accelerant. You can find me on the web under the pseudonym of Skipnote, and the slides and the code are live on these two links. Later in the after the session, I'll be tweeting them out. You can find my Twitter handle at the bottom corner of the slides. So before we get into how to set up a cloud environment for development, let's talk about what are the reasons that would lead you to a cloud environment for development. What would be the challenges that you would face? So first up, you have limited resources, right? So imagine you are working on a laptop that is 4 gigs of RAM or 8 gigs of RAM. These days, Drupal projects are quite heavy to run, so that doesn't really work out with 4 or 8 GBs, right? And also, you are running a lot of services, a lot of containers, a lot of databases, various other things. So your laptop doesn't really sort of work out really well, and then also like it affects your productivity as well. Other than that, there could be reasons like unsupported software, right? So imagine you are somebody who prefers using Windows, but the requirements are that you set up an environment where there is Linux so that you can build all the dependencies, right? So that can be one of the reasons. And finally, a crucial reason or a challenge would be in case you want to onboard somebody new to your project and you have limited time. So that can be another challenge when you would consider cloud environments. So now, before I go to the reason where, or like talk about like where cloud environments shine, let's talk about the conventional solutions that one would sort of opt for before going to the cloud environments. So in case of limited resources, right, you would procure a new laptop. So you'll order a new laptop. One, it's really expensive, and two, it will take some time, right? Like it can be days, it can be weeks to reach to get a new laptop, right? In case you are switching operating system, right? So in case you're going from Windows to Linux, it's a lot of work, right? You have to back up your whole system, and then you have to install a new system, a Linux system, say Ubuntu, and then you have to learn that operating system. So again, there's an investment there. And finally, in case you are onboarding somebody, right? So you want to onboard somebody to work on this new project, and before they sort of even get productive, right? So they need to set up the whole project on their machine, and to do that they might run into a lot of challenges. So to help with that, you will sort of dedicate somebody to help them set up the project on their machines, and that's again a lot of effort. So this is where you would consider cloud environments. So in case of limited resources, right? So cloud environments can be as small as 512 MBs of RAM to terabytes of RAM, and it can have like hundreds of CPU cores. But again, like it's not necessarily you want to opt for that, but then there are a lot of options. So uh, that helps you solve the limited resources challenge. In terms of operating systems or software support, most of the cloud providers provide a lot of operating system support and their older versions or the latest versions, so you can easily switch between any of the operating system based on your requirements very easily. And finally, in terms of onboarding somebody, you can basically on by just by running a few scripts, you can have a new environment for development ready for somebody you want to onboard on your project, right? So this would be a tested environment. You know what exactly is there, how it works. So there's no configuration required as such. So this will again save you a lot of time. Moving on, now what is really required to set up such an environment? What are the minimum required pieces for this, right? So first you need a cloud compute resource. So this can be any cloud, right? Like there's no particular cloud that you need. It can run on any cloud, right? So it can be GCP, the Google Cloud Platform. It can be Linode. It can be DigitalOcean. It can be your own custom server, or anything else for that matter. But in case of this session, I'll be using AWS. Uh, you need a browser to run the application to access the development environment. So again, any browser works, any modern browser. But just for the demonstration, I'm using Google Chrome. And finally, you need a remote to connect to the remote server to continue your development. You need a code editor or IDE, and I'll be using VS Code. It's a pretty decent editor, and then it supports a lot of things. Other than that, you can also use PHP Storm. It has its own tools, and it's certainly supported as well. So there to set up this environment, there are like a lot of ways to do it, right? Like you can manually sort of set up a new instance, a new server, then you can install the applications and then start working on it, right? So there are like a lot of manual steps, and I have documented the whole setup, and I've put the video link on the slides. However, the problem with the manual setup is that you have to manually install everything. First, you need to set up the server, you need to configure the server, add the storage, add the networking, and so on, and then you need to install all the application. And in case something goes wrong, you have to do it once again, like from scratch at times. And in case you want to do it for somebody else, again there are like a lot of steps, the same steps you have to follow again. So it's very time consuming, and we won't be doing that in this session. So instead, we'll be using a couple of tools to automate this whole process. And these two tools are Terraform and Ansible. So with Terraform, we will quickly spin up an EC2 instance on AWS and the surrounding requirements for networking, storage, and other things. And then we will use the tool called Ansible to provision and install various applications on this machine that we have provisioned using Terraform. So this is something we'll look into in this session. So that's pretty much it with the slides. I'll be demoing everything going forward from here, and the demo would run with the following steps. So first, we'll review my AWS EC2 dashboard. Then we will provision a new AWS instance using Terraform. Once the Terraform instance is set up, we will install all the relevant applications using Ansible. Then we'll connect to the instance using SSH and see like if everything is there, it's working as expected. Then we will configure our IDE. And before we wrap up, we'll set up a whole Drupal environment. We'll validate everything. We'll set up things like Xdebug, which is like one of the requirements when you're working on a complex Drupal project, in case you need it. And then finally, we will look at development in the browser. So how you can use various tools. So in case you don't have your laptop with you, so you have your iPad, you can continue there as well. So let's move on. So I have basically, like in the links, I've shared the link to the repository. So this is the repository I've linked in the slides, and I've cloned it on my machine as well. So let me open it here. This is the repository, and it has a README document. So in case you want to set up a similar environment, you can just follow through the README. The only prerequisite that is here is that you have an free tier AWS account. You don't need a paid account. Just a free tier account is fine to run a Drupal instance, to run a development environment. So let's follow these steps. I'll be talking through what each of these does, and we'll go through it. So the first thing we want to do is we want to generate SSH keys. The reason why we are doing this is because we want to keep our environment secure, and we don't want to use passwords that are vulnerable. So we will generate an SSH key that would be used to access the environment. So let me open the terminal here. Hopefully everybody can see this clear enough. And let me create a directory called keys. And in this directory, I will place all my SSH keys. Right, so I'm using SSH keygen to generate the keys within this directory. I won't put any password for these keys. I'll just generate them. And immediately in the keys directory, you can see the keys are here. So there's a key, a private key, and then there's a public key. The private key would remain on our machine, and the public key would be uploaded to our AWS instance using Terraform. Now that the keys are there, let's move ahead and generate our instance, create our new AWS EC2 instance using Terraform. So I'll change the directory to, there's a directory called Terraform, and there's a directory in that called instance. So I'll change into that, and I'll run Terraform init, which basically initializes a Terraform module. And after that, I'll run Terraform apply, which basically takes the configuration from the file, which is this file, and it will sort of create my instance. So let me run this using Terraform apply. It will prompt me to accept this certain changes. So it's telling me that it is going to create these resource, right? So it's going to create a VPC, it's going to create subnet, and further other things. I'll talk about it, but let me meanwhile say yes to this and then talk through the whole thing. So I'll talk about certain things here. So we are configuring the region here. So I'm setting the region to AP South 1. This is basically Mumbai, which is the closest region to me. You would want to do the same thing, like set the closest availability zone to you so that the latency is minimum. Then we are creating a AWS EC2 instance here, which is called AWS instance. I'm creating a T2 micro instance. This is a free tier instance, so you can run it for free for a year. It's from what I remember, 512 or 1 GB of RAM, two CPUs, something around that. And then there's an AMI, which basically means what's the underlying operating system. This corresponds to an Ubuntu image. And moving on, I'm sort of linking my keys here. So this is my key pair, and I'm setting a 20 GBs of volume on the instance. So I have 20 GBs of space. By the way, you can see like the instance has already been created, but let me go through the whole file first. Other than that, I'm sort of setting some security, right? So I don't want this instance to be accessible to anyone, right? So I want it to be secure. Only certain people should be able to access it, and only certain parts of the instance should be accessible. So what I'm telling it here is only access, like only allow access through SSH, which is secured by keys. So I'm telling it allow access to the port 22, and also I'm allowing port 8080 over TCP. So basically, this is the only IP address that you can access in your browser, and we'll talk about it at the very end of the presentation. On the other hand, the server can access any port through across any protocol from the server, right? So in case you are on the server and you run any command to fetch data through any protocol, you should be able to do it. So that's why we're telling it 00, which means basically anything, and -1 means any protocol. So whether it's TCP, it's UDP, it's any other protocol for that matter. Here we are sort of accessing our keys that we recently generated. Here we are sort of setting up further networking. So we are creating a VPC, internet gateway, subnets. I won't go into the details of this. But at the very end, we have something called outputs, right? So this outputs the IP address of our instance and the instance's ID, right? So you can see at the very bottom, when we ran the command, you can see the instance ID is there and the IP address is there, right? So you can see like this basically confirms that something has happened, and this is the output from it. Now let's go to our EC2 dashboard, right? So I'll open console.aws.com. And since I've recently visited EC2, let me click here and quickly go there. So under instances, I can see like one instance is running, right? So I'll click on this instance ID. So you can see the IP address is at the end, it's 34.164. If I go back to VS Code, I can see 34.164. So this is the instance that was created using Terraform. Now, the instance is created. It certainly isn't accessible through port 80, which is the HTTP port. So we can check that under security. So you can see like I've just opened port 8080 through TCP and only SSH, which is port 22. Now going back, let's move on to the next steps. We have our instance ready. Now let's install the required software on it, right? So I will first save this IP address as a shell variable, environment variable. So I've set it as VMIP. And now I will update inventory file, which is basically telling Ansible that, hey, run these commands on this IP address. So after running this command, we'll see that under Ansible, there's a file called inventory. Under inventory, there's something called host.ini. So here we sort of updated our IP address. From here, we took it, and then I could have manually done this as well, but then I used sed to do it. Now let's go back to the file and run the Ansible playbook. Right. So this is basically where we would install all the software on the instance. So while it runs, let me talk through what we are doing here. So in the playbook, we have a number of things that we are going to install. So first, we are installing Docker. This is using a community package. So there are a lot of packages available on Ansible Galaxy. So you can, rather than sort of creating everything from scratch, you can just download a community package and use that, and it will save you a lot of time. So we are installing Docker, then we are setting up some swap space on this instance. So it's a Linux machine, so we are setting up swap so that it's more efficient. We are installing PHP and Composer. I don't want to do this, so I will comment it off. This will save us some time, so I'll rerun the playbook. So I'll just install Docker, set up some swap, and install code server. Right. So PHP, Composer, and Node.js we'll install in a different way, and I'll talk about it in a second. Once these are installed, just a second, I think something is failing here. Okay, I think like because I stopped it midway, maybe that led to some problem. But okay, let's give it a few seconds and see where it fails. So okay, hopefully it doesn't fail again. Ensure dependencies are installed, and yeah, it has crossed that. Okay, so now that it's moving forward, so it's going to install Docker, setting up swap, and then code server. After that, we have two options, right? In case you want to set up an environment using Lando, you can use Lando or you can use DDev, right? So I've commented out DDev because I'll be using Lando in this setup. Once Lando is set up on this machine, we will set up our terminal. So I like to sort of configure my terminal, at least the prompt part of it, so that I can see the branches, I can see the current state where I'm at, and so on. So I'll be setting up ZSH on the instance as well. So this will take some time. So it will set up the swap, then it will install the code server, Lando, and ZSH, right? So let's while it does that, let's look at how you can set up your code editor, which is the next step. So uh, I have a few plugins installed on my VS Code. So let's take a look. So I have Drupal syntax highlighting. So because I'm working on mostly on a Drupal project, so I need syntax highlighting across theme file, module files, ink files, and so on. So for that, I have installed Drupal syntax highlighting. Uh, and something else that I really need is PHP debug to work with Xdebug. And I also need Twig. So again, like in case you're working with Twig files, you need Twig as well. But to access the remote server, the most important thing that you need is a remote SSH, right? So in case you search for remote-SSH, you'll find this module called remote-SSH by Microsoft. All you need to do is install it, and once you have installed it, you'll see a in your sidebar something called Remote Explorer like this. And by default, it would be empty. So let me also clear mine. So by default, it would look something like this, right? So it says no SSH hosts have been configured, right? So basically, it means there is nothing to connect to. But earlier, we saw that like once the Terraform had run, right, like it outputted some IP address, right? This is the IP address it gave us. So that means this is the IP address we would connect to. So in my remote explorer under SSH targets, I'll click on this plus button and I'll put in SSH Ubuntu at this IP address, right? I'll click enter and I'll choose the SSH config file under my home directory. And then instead of connecting to it, because Ansible Playbook is currently running, which seem to have failed now. Okay. Uh, Instead of connecting, I'll click on config, right? So that I can configure this. Let me quickly make a change here and run the playbook again. So now you can see like because I have added the SSH target here, it's showing up here on the left side in the SSH targets. This is the host name, so I can rename it to anything. So I'll call it AWS, and if I refresh here, it will show AWS here. This is the IP address we connect to, and this is the user. But in case I try to connect it, it will throw errors because we are not providing it the key that we generated, right? To do that, I'll say identity key. Identity file rather, and then I'll give it, this is not correct, but let's pull in the correct path. So user slash skip note related, let's do it like this. So we copy this path, which is the current directory. This path should, by the way, be always an absolute path, so that it knows where exactly the key is placed. So I'll say, because I don't want to put in the public key, I'll just say key, right? So now let's look at where this is at. So it's currently installing Node.js. Just as an heads up, earlier I ran the playbook without Node.js and Lando failed. The reason why we need Node.js is because I'm building Lando from source, and for Lando to work on a remote environment, it needs to be built from source. So that's why we are installing Node.js first, and then we'll install Lando. So currently it's installing Yarn, which is a dependency for Lando to be installed, and then after that it will install Lando. Meanwhile, let's go back to our SSH targets, and you can see AWS has shown up here, right? So I can refresh. I can now right click on it and click on connect a new window. However, before I do that, I just want this playbook to complete so that I don't interrupt any processes. So we'll just wait for a few seconds, and in case it takes longer than that, I'll just go ahead and connect right away. So it's installing code server at this point, and after that, it should install Lando. So I'm just waiting on that. Okay, so this is installed. Now it's setting up Lando. Okay, now it's installing Lando dependencies, and with that, it should be done. Okay. So we have Lando installed as well. So finally, it's installing ZSH, and it will set up the prompt. And with that, the whole environment should be set up. Okay. So I'm installing Starship, which is a prompt utility, and yeah, it's installed, and you can see like it says that there were 20 changes made, and 23 things were skipped, and one was ignored. So that means the whole playbook was run. So what I can do immediately is right click on this target and say you can connect in the same window or you can connect in a new window. I clicked on the current window, so it's now connecting, as you can see here, uh, and yeah, this is our Ubuntu machine that we provisioned, and you can see the prompt has changed. So if I do echo dollar shell, so this would say ZSH, and you can see my prompt is formatted properly as well. Now let's set up Drupal instance on this, right? So what I'll do is I'll use git.drupal.org and clone a Drupal instance from here. So I won't use Composer to create a project, primarily because I don't have PHP or Composer installed. And I'll talk about that in a second, why I don't directly want to install these two dependencies on my machine. So I'll do git clone, and I'll set a depth of 1 so that the clone is faster. Although because it's running in an AWS environment, it will anyways be quite fast. Okay, I should be using, instead of SSH, because my SSH keys aren't there in this machine, I'll use HTTPS instead. And it will quickly clone this. And once it's cloned, I will open this new directory which we cloned, right? So it's called Drupal. So I'll click on open folder in the left side, and I'll choose Drupal. So once I click OK, it will again reload the VS Code window. I'll say I trust, and then you can see all the Drupal files, the Drupal repository files on the left side. It says SSH AWS because that's what we named our SSH target here. And in the bottom left corner, you can also see, like in blue, it says SSH AWS. So this sort of notifies that you are running uh, Drupal in SSH mode. Now let me set up this project using Lando. So I'll do Lando init. I'm already in the Drupal directory. I'll say like it's in the current directory. So I'll click current directory, and then I'll choose Drupal 9. And I'll say like the project is configured in the current directory because we have all the files here. So index file is there and so on. So I'll click this and I'll call this project Drupal. Now it says the project is ready and it has generated a .lando file here. Right? So I won't change anything. I'll just add xdebug true so that I don't need to later rebuild the project. So I'll do lando start. However, there's one thing that I'm yet to validate is whether Docker has all the permissions, and we'll know it immediately in a second. So it seems it's taking a while. So let's quickly check here. So in case I run Docker images, I'm getting this permission denied, which means there is a problem, right? And I need to provide it permissions. Again, in the README, I have sort of written certain steps that you might need to run into, that you might need to run in case you face certain challenges. So let's open the README here, and we need to run these three commands. So let me go back here and run these three commands. Yeah, hopefully now let's see. Let me close this window and run Docker images. Yeah, it's running now. So let me do lando start again. So yeah, immediately it shows you a prompt, and then it starts downloading the relevant Docker images that are used by Lando. The reason why I'm using Lando is because and using a Docker containers within a VM is because I want to set up multiple projects and their dependencies are different. So every project requires a different version of PHP, Node, MySQL, and so on. So I don't want to keep managing those dependencies. So that's why I use Lando, and it makes the setting up the environment quite easy. And the primary environment that the VM that we provisioned will have the minimal dependencies. So while it sort of setups downloads all these images, let me create a custom module which we will use for demonstration of xdebug, right? So we'll call this module ashwin. So we'll have a info.yaml file, and then we'll name it ashwin. Description is not required. We'll put in type as module. Core version requirement, let's put it at 9. This should be good enough. And then also let's create a ashwin.module file where we will uh, initiate the trigger the breakpoint. If you see the module file is not doesn't have any sort of syntax highlighting. So if I write PHP, you see like there's no syntax highlighting. So for this, you'll have to go to the extensions panel, and certain modules need to be installed on the server as well, right? So Drupal syntax highlighting prompts you that install on the SSH AWS. So I'll click on this. Uh, okay, now it's installing, and I will also install PHP debug as well, which I require to trigger PHP debug. And now you see like it's showing me the right syntax. So let me write a function. Let's call it ashwill underscore preprocess HTML, and we will trigger was right, and this should be enough to trigger a breakpoint. So we'll go ahead with this. Right. So meanwhile, Lando has set up it. It downloaded all the Docker container images. It ran the set up the containers, and now at the very bottom you see we have various app server URLs. We can't really access the lando.site URLs from externally, but we can certainly access these URLs. And we are especially interested in the non-HTTPS, the HTTP URL. So this is the URL. So I'll copy this. I'll go to my browser, and if I paste it in, I'm able to access it here, right? So, but the prompt says that autoload.php file is missing, right? So to access that, what I'll do is I'll do lando composer install. By the way, every time there are URLs exposed, uh, VS Code will automatically set port forwarding, right? So this port has been forwarded to this port, right? So at times the port numbers are different. This time it's the same. So that's how it's sort of working on my local. But in case somebody else tries to access this URL, they won't be able to access it. Only I'm able to access it because I have VS Code configured accordingly. It's running on my machine, and I have sort of set up the port forwarding here. Okay, going back here. So we have composer install done, we'll also do composer require drush so that we can use the various drush commands. We'll use this primarily to set up the site. So if I currently go to the site, it says like install the whole site. I'll just use drush to do it. So drush is also installed. So I'll do lando drush si, and I'll sort of put in all the required information, right? So the database, because we set up a Drupal 9 project, it's the database is Drupal 9. Driver is MySQL. Username would again be Drupal 9. Password is also Drupal 9. The host would be database because that's how the container networking is set up. The port remains the same, and I'll say yes. And finally, it will start installing the website. So let's just give it a few seconds, and then we should be able to access the website. Instead of the core/install, we'll directly go to the primary URL. And at the very end, it will prompt for the password. So I'll copy that so that I can use it to log in. Hopefully the site should be installed. Yeah, it's installed. I'll access it using admin and then the password here. So you can see the site is installed. I'll enable the module that we created a few minutes ago. So it's called Ashwell. You can see it here. I can enable it. I'll install it. And the module is installed, right? So I'll go back to the site. Now we wanted to demonstrate Xdebug. So let's go here and close all the files. I will set up the debugger. So I'll go to the debugging panel and click on create a launch JSON file. So I'll select PHP. This option is only available once I install the extension. The only thing that I need to set up here is the path mapping between the Docker container, the Lando containers, and the path of this directory in the server. So within Lando container, it's running in a directory called app, and the path of this folder would just be workspace folder. So it would automatically figure that out, like what this path is. So now this is done. I can click on run and debug. Right. So debugger has started, but there is no breakpoint set. So we created this file called ashfield.module. So let me set up a breakpoint here on line number 4. So if I go over here and refresh, nothing gets triggered, right? So let's see why is that. So let's start by doing a drush cache clear, because that in most cases solves every problem. So let's see if that does it here as well. Refresh again. Yeah, it immediately stops the breakpoint here. So you can see all the variables under HTML and so on, right? Like you can set up watchers, you can see the call stack, you can have multiple breakpoints, and like it's the normal Xdebug setup. So with this, we can have complete Xdebug setup running as well. And by the way, like I had this Xdebug Chrome extension already enabled. So in case it's not, it won't work. So you need to enable it by clicking on debug. That's pretty much it. So with this, we have been able to pretty much complete up till here, right? So we have been sort of able to complete our checklist. So let's now go ahead and check the final step, which is development in the browser in case you want to do it. So earlier, I talked about that we have exposed SSH and another URL, a TCP URL port 8080 right here from our instance, right? So this is for code server. So let's again take a look at our IP address. So I can go into Terraform directly and say like Terraform output, I think. I'm not sure if this is the right command, but let's see. Yeah, so this is our IP address. So I'll copy this and open the tab and then put in 8080 at the very end. So this opens code server. It asks for a password. So the password is configured under Ansible. There's a file called variables, and you'll see the code server password is skip note. So I'll just put it in here, click submit. And with this, I should have VS Code similarly running here as well. So I can browse through the file. Let me open again the Drupal directory here as well. I'll click on open folder. For some reason, Yeah. So I'll select Drupal. And yeah, again, you can see like all the files are showing up here. So if I go to modules, Asheville, the module file is here, right? So you can continue the development. So basically this browser, this URL is accessible on your phone, on your iPad, on your very low powered machine. So you don't necessarily need to worry about that. So this is especially handy in case your machine is underpowered. Recently we had challenges with a lot of developers having M1 laptop, which wasn't like Lando wasn't properly supported. So we set up these remote environments and they were able to continue development on cloud VMs. Other than that, in case your laptop gets heated very quickly due to a lot of resources running, this is also especially useful in those cases as well. So with that, uh, we have covered all the aspects as a part of the session demo. I'll be happy to answer any questions in case there are any. And like I said, the slides and the code are available on these two links, and I'll be sharing them through my Twitter account as well later on. So in case there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
You can put your questions in the session chat.
Okay. Let me stop my screen share and put in the slides on the chat as well. And here's the repo as well. All right. It seems there are no questions. So thank you everyone who joined.
Thank you, Bassam, for the excellent presentation. So you need to go back to the Hopkin reception area and look for your next activity. Thanks for joining us.
All right. Thank you. Bye bye.